Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to talk about an HOA that wants access to my gate. I've lived on this property since I was a kid, but I only became its legal owner about 5 years ago when my father decided to move closer to my sister in a different state. Even then, I think he always knew I'd be the one who wanted to keep the house and the yard exactly as it was. There's this gorgeous lake behind the wooded area that touches my backyard, and a narrow trail along the fence line leads all the way down to the shoreline. The land is technically mine, fenced off in most places except for one locked gate that opens onto a smaller slope. It's the perfect place for me to go on evening walks after a long day. Since I was a kid, I've treasured that path, and I never expected to be in a conflict with the local homeowners association. My father had steered clear of them, even though our land is technically within the boundaries of a neighborhood that has an HOA. But Dad's property predated the HOA's formation by decades, so we were never obligated to be members or pay any dues. The property had all the rights and claims of an independent homestead, or so my father's old property deeds explained. Even with all that, I never had any big issues with the local neighbors. At least, not until last year when everything seemed to spiral out of control. That's when the HOA board, in an effort to expand their so-called community spirit, decided they wanted access to the lake at the far edge of my property, and their method for getting that access was more ridiculous than I ever could have imagined. Let me give you a bit of context. My property sits on about 4 acres of semi-wooded land. It used to be farmland way back when my grandparents owned it, but now it's mostly just tall grass, a large vegetable garden, and a small orchard. When I was a teenager, my father installed a chain-link fence around the backyard for my mother's peace of mind. A few years after that, Dad built a wooden privacy fence closer to the house for our dogs. Eventually, we ended up with both, an outer fence near the edges of the property line and an inner fence for the dogs. Over time, Dad added a gate to the outer fence at the back corner, facing the lake. He said it was mostly so he could go fishing without having to climb over the fence. He put a simple padlock on that gate to keep random trespassers out, as well as the occasional deer or fox that found its way up the slope from the lakeside. Dad always taught me that property rights mattered. I might not be a lawyer, but I learned from him how to read legal documents and understand the basics of property deeds, easements, and so on. The local HOA was formed about 15 years ago to govern some new developments on the other side of the lake. Over the years, they added more roads, more houses, and turned the area from a small farmland community into something busier. They had a clubhouse, a pool, a golf course membership for residents, and a variety of different fees for maintenance and improvement. None of that involved me directly. We mostly kept to ourselves. But the new HOA board, led by a woman named Charmaine, who, mind you, had never once introduced herself to me in any neighborly way, decided that it would be beneficial for the entire neighborhood to have closer access to the lake. The main route to the lake from the HOA community is a winding public trail on the other side. It's not that far, but it requires folks to drive or walk an extra 15 or 20 minutes because the terrain is kind of hilly and there aren't many direct roads. Charmaine apparently thought that my property's back gate would be the perfect solution to create a shortcut. One day, I got an official-looking letter in my mailbox. It had the HOA logo on the top. The letter was somewhat polite, but stated that the HOA had identified my property as an optimal access point for local residents to reach the lake. They claimed that I had a community obligation to share my gate. They politely requested that I provide them with a copy of the key so that their members, who paid annual dues, would have an easier time enjoying the local lake. They also mentioned that they were sure I wanted to foster good relationships with neighbors and not appear, in their words, needlessly difficult. I didn't know whether to laugh or be offended. We'd never been members of this HOA. We'd never paid dues, and we weren't subject to their regulations. My father had made sure that all that was crystal clear when the HOA first formed. This was literally a case of them asking to put a traffic lane through my backyard, so I decided to respond politely but firmly. I drafted a letter back, stating that I had no intention of handing over any keys. I didn't owe them any community obligation because my property was outside their governance. I also noted that it was private property, and giving random people unsupervised access would raise safety and liability concerns. I mentioned that I'd be happy to keep lines of communication open, but I felt no reason to open my back gate as a public thoroughfare. I sent my letter by certified mail, It must have arrived within a day or two because the very next weekend, Charmaine and 2 other HOA board members showed up at my front door. They knocked on the door with that sense of self-importance that certain community board folks carry. Acting like they were on official business, Charmaine stood there in a neatly pressed suit jacket, even though it was a casual Saturday afternoon. She was flanked by Henry, an older man with a slightly confused expression, and Elena, a middle-aged woman who lived in one of the larger houses near the golf course. I recognized them vaguely from local events, but we were never on a first-name basis. Charmaine did most of the talking. She basically repeated everything in the letter, maybe in more condescending language. She insisted it was a matter of neighborly courtesy and that I needed to be more understanding of the community's needs. I told them calmly that my stance hadn't changed. I would not be unlocking my private gate for public use, nor would I distribute any keys. I tried to keep the conversation polite, but Charmaine's voice started to rise, talking about how it was rude of me not to cooperate, how the right thing to do was to let people on the other side of the neighborhood enjoy the lake without going the long way around. I gently reminded her that it's not my problem how they choose to access the lake. If they want a direct route, they can purchase some land themselves or create a public path that bypasses private property. She was not pleased. She said something like, "People in this neighborhood will see you as petty for locking up property like a fortress. We expect you to behave in a way that signals respect for your neighbors, not hostility." That set my teeth on edge. Hostility? Respect? I was providing basic courtesy by not telling them to leave my porch immediately. I said, "I will not be handing out keys to strangers or acquaintances I barely know. My property is my own. If I want to go to the lake, I'll do so, but that's for my family and me. I am sorry you feel inconvenienced, but this is final." I thought that would be the end of it. However, Charmaine wasn't done. She stormed off my porch with Henry and Elena trailing behind. As she was walking away, she turned to me and said, "We'll see about that. You can't just ignore our entire community." I wasn't quite sure what she meant, but it was ominous enough that I had a restless night. I have an old friend named Jesse who used to work as a paralegal in real estate law, so I gave her a call to confirm that I was in the right. Jesse told me that as long as my property wasn't part of the HOA and I had no legal obligation via an easement or anything else, I was free to keep my gate locked and restricted. She suggested I keep an eye on them, though, because HOAs can sometimes get creative about pushing boundaries. A few days later, I started getting notices in my mailbox from the HOA. These weren't just letters. One was a warning that my property was out of compliance with community guidelines for not maintaining an approved fence style. Another was a fine notice telling me that I owed the HOA $200 for refusing to comply with a direct order. Bear in mind, I am not a member of their HOA. I don't pay dues. They have no legal authority over me. But it seemed like Charmaine or someone on her board had decided that peppering me with official-looking notices might scare me into submission. I kept all those notices in a folder. I didn't respond to them individually because my father and I had clarified years ago that we were not subject to their rules. Soon after, I received another letter claiming they would take further action if I didn't comply. That's when I decided I had to push back more formally. I asked Jesse to draft a cease and desist letter. The letter basically stated that the HOA must stop sending me these baseless notices and must cease harassing me. It clarified that my property was, by original deed, not within their jurisdiction. We included a copy of the relevant legal documents. The intimidation temporarily stopped. For about 2 months, I heard nothing more from the HOA. I thought maybe they'd come to their senses, especially because I had let them know I was prepared to get the law involved if necessary. But then, as summer approached, apparently the desire to have a shortcut to the lake became irresistible again. My guess is they realized their residents really wanted that lake access for fishing, picnics, and canoeing. The main route to the lake is actually pretty nice, but it's indeed longer. One must park near a small public lot, walk a half-mile trail, and then arrive at the shoreline that's a bit muddy. My side of the lake has a gently sloping bank with minimal undergrowth, making it more attractive for families. One hot morning in late May, I was out in my yard, tending to my vegetable garden, when I noticed a small group of people standing near the back fence. Some had measuring tapes, and a couple had notepads. They were on the lake side of the fence. My property line is about 5 feet from the actual shoreline, looking in at my gate. It was locked as usual, but it looked like they were discussing whether they could do something with it. I walked over and asked if I could help them. They all jumped, not expecting me to be there. One of them introduced himself as Dale, a surveyor hired by the HOA. He said he was there to map the property lines for a proposed community improvement project. I clarified that my property line extends a good distance behind that fence and that the HOA had no permission to survey or do anything on my land. Dale seemed genuinely surprised. He told me that Charmaine had hired him, claiming there was an agreement in place and that I had consented to let them measure around the fence. I told him politely but firmly that no, that was not accurate. I had given no consent whatsoever. Then I directed them to vacate the area. They had no right to be there. Dale, looking baffled, apologized and led his team away. Before he left, he said, "I'm sorry to bother you. I was just told to come here. I didn't know the real situation." I believed him. It seemed like Charmaine was feeding misinformation to the people she hired to strong-arm me. Shortly after that survey incident, I posted a conspicuous sign on the fence stating, "Private property, no trespassing." I also installed a small camera overlooking the gate. It wasn't fancy, just a motion-activated camera that could record short clips. I wanted to make sure I had evidence of any tampering. Over the next few weeks, I caught footage of random people coming up to the gate and rattling it, sometimes peering through. Usually they'd leave after a few seconds, realizing it was locked. But then, in early June, I found a piece of paper taped to the outside of the gate that read, "You're being petty. Open the gate for the neighborhood, or face the consequences." It wasn't signed. To me, it looked like the kind of note a disgruntled neighbor might leave when they're angry. I wasn't sure if it was an empty threat or if something bigger was coming. Around the same time, I started noticing items gone missing from my property. One day, I found that a gardening tool disappeared from the side of my house. Another day, an old bird feeder was taken off its hook in a tree. I initially chalked it up to random petty theft, but it made me uneasy. I didn't have evidence linking it to the HOA or any specific person. Still, I decided to be more vigilant. A week later, the real drama began. The HOA, or at least Charmaine and her cronies, decided to show up at my house with a group of about 5 people. They came to the front door on a Saturday morning. They had a video camera rolling, probably to record any argument or something they might later spin to their advantage. Charmaine started lecturing me the moment I opened the door. She held up a ring of keys and said, "This is your last chance to cooperate. We have a key to your outer fence, but we need the key to your gate lock at the back. Are you going to be reasonable, or do you want the entire community to see how selfish you are?" For a moment, I was stunned. They had a key to my outer fence? I asked her what she meant. She smirked and said, "We changed your chain link lock. Now we just need the key to the wooden gate near the lake." I immediately marched around to the side yard, followed by the group. Sure enough, the simple padlock Dad had installed on the chain link section was missing, replaced by a brand new lock. They'd literally cut off my lock and put their own padlock on my fence. I was outraged, telling them they had no right to alter my property. Charmaine had the audacity to smile and say, "We just wanted to demonstrate that this fence is easily accessible for the community anyway, so you might as well hand over the key to the lower gate." I demanded they leave my property. I said, "You have about 5 seconds to get off my land before I call the police." Charmaine pressed me again. "Hand over the key or we'll call the authorities and tell them you've locked us out of a community asset." I lost it. I told her, "This is my personal property, not a community asset." Then I pulled out my cell phone and dialed the local police department's non-emergency line. I calmly explained that a group was trespassing and had vandalized my property by cutting off my lock. While I was on the phone, Charmaine got flustered and started telling her entourage to pack up, but one of them, an older gentleman, said he wanted to see how it played out. When the police arrived, I showed them the new lock the HOA had installed. I showed them the broken padlock they had discarded in my side yard. Charmaine insisted that the fence was part of the neighborhood's perimeter, a bizarre claim with zero merit. I had the original deed and the boundary maps that clearly placed the fence line well inside my property. The police officer patiently looked over the documents and eventually told Charmaine and her group that they were indeed trespassing and had committed an act of vandalism. The officer told them they could be charged if I chose to press charges. Charmaine turned red in the face. She then tried a different approach, telling the officer that I was withholding the gate key so that the community couldn't enjoy the lake. The officer, looking somewhat amused by that point, explained calmly, "Ma'am, that's not how private property works. You have no right to demand keys to someone else's gate. If they don't want to give it to you, they don't have to." Her entourage started arguing amongst themselves. I could hear snippets like, We were told we had a right, and this is going to make us look bad. Finally, Charmaine pleaded with me. If we got your permission to put up a path, would you share the key? I told her absolutely not, given how they had treated me. I said, even if you had asked politely from day one, I probably would still say no, because this is my private property and I'm not comfortable unlocking it for every random person in the neighborhood. But now, with all the harassment, there's no chance. The officer instructed them to remove their padlock and leave the property immediately. Henry, the older man in the group, used some bolt cutters to remove the lock they had placed. Then they all left under the watchful eye of the police. I didn't press charges for vandalism that day, though in hindsight, maybe I should have. Instead, I replaced the lock on my fence with a sturdier one and added a large sign that said, "Private property, no unauthorized access." I believed that might finally end the matter. That week, though, I found out just how relentless Charmaine could be. She apparently went to my other neighbors who lived in the older part of the community, those not fully under HOA rules but still sometimes impacted by the association, and tried to rally them against me. A neighbor named Camden, who lives about a quarter-mile down the road, came by to warn me that Charmaine was telling everyone I was hoarding lake access and making life difficult for families who wanted to swim and fish closer to home. Camden and I had a talk by the fence line one evening. He told me Charmaine was going around telling families that I was intentionally blocking them from a public resource out of spite. Camden knew that wasn't true because he had seen all the nonsense with the surveyors and the padlock. He even overheard Charmaine bragging that she had ways to get around my refusal. Camden said he felt uneasy with all the rumors swirling. During this time, I also developed another concern: potential conflict with a new neighbor who moved in behind me on a small property that touches the far corner of my land. His name was Tyler, and he was one of the folks who believed he should get access to the lake by walking through my back gate. Tyler had kids, and from what I heard, he joined the HOA right after he bought his house. He started leaving me notes that read, "We'd love to use the lake on weekends. Can you spare a key?" At first, these notes were polite. I ignored them, hoping he'd give up. But as the HOA situation escalated, Tyler's notes became more insistent. Then one day, he came to my door. Unlike Charmaine's group, he tried to be friendly. "Hey, I'm Tyler. I'm new in town. I was just thinking maybe you could let us go through your yard to the lake occasionally, since we're neighbors." He offered to pay me a small monthly fee if that would make a difference. It was an awkward conversation, because Tyler seemed naive about the conflict swirling around the HOA. He didn't realize how large the can of worms was that he was opening. I explained that I wasn't comfortable giving out access. I told him about the persistent harassment from the HOA and how things had gotten out of hand. He seemed surprised. He told me that Charmaine had made it sound like the entire neighborhood was collectively allowed to use my gate. I gently clarified that this was not the case and never had been. Tyler apologized and left. From that day on, he didn't bother me anymore, but I later found out that Charmaine was pressuring him to keep after me. It all culminated about a month later when I saw 2 police cruisers drive up to my property in the early evening. I was alarmed, thinking something terrible had happened. But when the officers approached, they said they were responding to a report that I was illegally blocking a community access point and preventing residents from using the lake. My jaw dropped. Charmaine had actually called the police on me again, but this time framing it as if I was doing something unlawful. Luckily, one of the officers was the same individual who had come to my aid when Charmaine trespassed with her group. The other was a younger officer who seemed curious about the situation. Once again, I provided the deed and the documentation showing I was not part of the HOA. I reiterated that my gate and fence were on private property. The more experienced officer rolled his eyes, clearly exasperated that he was back out here on the same kind of nonsense call. He told me quietly that the HOA had called them, claiming I was belligerent and refusing to abide by community regulations. The officer told Charmaine, who was standing off to the side along with 2 or 3 neighbors, exactly what he had before. I was within my rights, and there was no law stating I had to share my property. One of Charmaine's sidekicks, a woman named Gail, piped up, "That's not fair. He's using a technicality to keep good people away from the lake." The officer shrugged and said, "That's how property ownership works. This is private land. There is no statutory right for you to cross it." He said if they continued to harass me, they might be liable for a civil complaint or even face harassment charges. I stood there silently, letting the officers do the talking. Part of me wanted to gloat, but I realized that would just add fuel to the fire. Finally, the officers left, telling Charmaine's group that this was not a matter for law enforcement and that they would not respond to further calls about the same issue. In the days that followed, my local friend Jessie urged me to consider a restraining order, or at least send another strongly worded cease and desist. She felt the HOA had overstepped multiple times. She even thought a lawsuit might be in order if they tried anything else. I was tempted, but I also felt that every time the HOA tried to escalate the matter, they ended up embarrassing themselves. The police had told them to back off. I was hopeful that this would be the final straw. Meanwhile, as all this was unfolding, I faced another personal challenge. My mother, who lived a few states away, needed help after a minor fall in her home. I had to drive back and forth to her place to coordinate her medical appointments, which meant my property was sometimes empty for days at a time. The good news was that my best friend, Brian, stayed at my house when I was gone to keep an eye on everything. Brian runs a small home improvement business, and he was between big projects, so he had time to help. He told me that on a couple of occasions, people came by the house looking for me, presumably from the HOA, but Brian politely turned them away, repeating that I wasn't part of their association. One evening, Brian heard suspicious noises near the back fence. By the time he got his flashlight and walked out there, whoever was there was gone, but he did find footprints and what looked like pry marks on the gate latch. Brian installed an even stronger lock and added a secondary latch higher up, just in case. He also installed a better camera system, one that captured clearer footage. We never got a clear image of who was messing with the gate, but it was obvious someone was determined to get in. The whole thing felt so surreal. All this for a shortcut to the lake. During one of my visits to my mother, I had a conversation with her about all the drama. She was shocked to hear how far the HOA was going. She told me about a similar issue my father had faced with a different neighbor years ago. Dad had to threaten legal action to make them stop. She advised me to keep firm boundaries and not give in. Hearing that gave me some added resolve. Sometimes I felt like maybe I was being too stubborn, but I had to remind myself that it was the HOA that was crossing the line by trying to take what wasn't theirs. By late summer, Charmaine seemed to lose some of her influence in the neighborhood. Camden told me that many residents were tired of her antics and outraged that HOA funds were being wasted on a personal vendetta. At the next HOA meeting, apparently people demanded to see the budget for the survey costs and legal mailings. Some board members started questioning Charmaine's leadership. She kept insisting that everything she had done was for the good of the community, but more and more people doubted that. A rumor spread that the HOA's attorney had sternly advised them to drop any attempts to force me to hand over access, because it could result in a losing lawsuit that would drain the HOA's finances. About a month later, I was working in my orchard, picking late-season peaches, when I noticed Charmaine's SUV roll up. She got out slowly and walked halfway up my driveway, but I could tell she was reluctant. I walked over to meet her, prepared for another confrontation, but she surprised me by speaking in a subdued tone. "We've decided not to pursue the lake access issue anymore," she said. "I just wanted you to know." It was the first time I'd seen her speak so quietly, almost like she was embarrassed. I told her I appreciated her letting me know. Then she tried to salvage some form of dignity by saying, "I still think you're being unreasonable, but it's not worth the trouble anymore." I nodded and said, "I understand, but my property is my property. I'm not changing my mind." She left without further argument. I wouldn't say we parted ways as friends, but there was at least an unspoken agreement that the fight had run its course. For a while, everything was peaceful. The police never returned for any more calls about illegal gates. The random attempts to mess with my fence stopped. I thought that was the end of it, until a series of events in early fall provided a final resolution that felt like poetic justice. It began when a local real estate blog published an article about HOAs in the area, listing both the pros and cons. The writer specifically mentioned a fiasco where an HOA board tried to force a homeowner to grant access to a lake through private property. It didn't name me, but it was obvious to anyone in town what the story was referencing. The article criticized the HOA for overreaching and highlighted how some associations waste money on frivolous legal battles. Apparently, this article sparked a discussion among some of the HOA's residents who were upset about rising dues and a lack of transparency. At the next board election, Charmaine lost her position as president. The new board president was a younger resident who campaigned on the platform of fiscal responsibility, and neighborly respect. I heard from Camden that Charmaine was furious, but she still lived in the neighborhood, so she had no choice but to watch her influence wane. As for Henry and Elena, the two board members who had accompanied her earlier, they also left their positions, either by choice or by the will of the voting members. One final note of justice came when the new board did a thorough review of the budget and discovered some questionable spending authorized by Charmaine, specifically the hiring of the surveyors, the repeated mailings, and some legal consultations that cost thousands. The board decided that Charmaine would be held accountable for exceeding her authorized spending limits. While they didn't press criminal charges, they demanded she pay back a portion of those costs or face a lawsuit from the HOA itself. She tried to fight it, but after everything that happened, she didn't have many allies left. I don't know the final details of Charmaine's settlement with the HOA, but I heard she had to foot a significant bill. It was all over the rumor mill for a week or two. In a sense, it was the perfect comeuppance for someone who had tried to strong-arm a neighbor into giving up private property rights for no reason other than convenience. Through it all, I never gave up that gate key, never provided any access, and the local police affirmed that I had every right to deny it. The new HOA board didn't bother me after they took over. They seemed more focused on repairing the association's reputation. Occasionally, I'll see some neighbors who used to side with Charmaine drive by. They'll give me a half-hearted wave or no greeting at all, but the drama has largely dissipated. To this day, I still keep my gate locked. I still walk that short slope to the water to fish, just like Dad used to do. Sometimes I bring a folding chair and a thermos of coffee, sitting by the lake to admire the sunset. On those evenings, I'll recall how this entire ordeal started over the simplest thing: neighbors wanting a shortcut, but instead of asking politely or accepting no as an answer, they tried to bully me. They learned the hard way that you can't just trample someone's property rights without consequences. As for me, I plan on keeping this property in my family indefinitely. It's too special to give up, filled with memories of my father, my grandparents, my own childhood. I don't mind if one day a truly friendly neighbor comes along and politely asks if we can share the lake access in some respectful way. I might still say no, but I wouldn't mind having the conversation. Until then, the gate stays locked, the sign stays posted, and the local lake is still accessible to anyone willing to take the official public route. And that's exactly how it should be. Friends, thank you. See you soon.